at the grey heavens, and a bitter wind swept through the estate gardens, scattering the last copper leaves across manicured lawns that had lost their summer verdancy. Inside the ancient chapel, candles flickered against stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of marriages, christenings, and funerals. Though today, Eleanor thought as she stood at the altar, the atmosphere felt decidedly more funeral than festive. Beside her, Edmund Ashworth, 5th Earl of Thornfield, stood rigid as the marble statuary that lined his family's crypt, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the stained glass windows that cast fractured light across the assembled guests. He had not looked at her once, not during the processional when she walked down the aisle alone, her father having died 2 years prior. Not during the vicar's droning recitation of vows that promised love, honor, and cherishing words that seemed to die in the cold air between them. Not even when he slipped the heavy Ashworth ring onto her trembling finger, his touch as impersonal as a banker conducting a transaction. Eleanor tried to find something, anything, in his aristocratic profile that might offer hope. The strong line of his nose, the dark hair touched with early silver at the temples, despite his 30 years, the broad shoulders that carried his title like armor. But his face remained a mask of cold civility, and when he spoke his vows, his voice carried no warmth, no inflection, nothing but the mechanical fulfillment of duty. The wedding breakfast that followed was an exercise in exquisite torture. Eleanor sat at the head table in her ivory silk gown, the lace at her throat feeling like a noose, while servants glided between guests, offering course after elaborate course that turned to ash in her mouth. Edmund sat beside her, so close she could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker, yet he might as well have been in another country for all the acknowledgement he gave her. Conversation flowed around them, guests offering toasts filled with hollow congratulations, but between the newly married Earl and Countess of Thornfield, there was only silence. Eleanor's mother had promised her that arranged marriages often blossomed into affection, that duty could transform into devotion given time and patience. Looking at her husband's glacial profile, Eleanor felt the first seeds of doubt take root in her heart, cold and bitter as the autumn wind that howled outside the manor's ancient walls. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin. Eleanor woke on her first morning, as the Countess of Thornfield, to find the other side of the bed undisturbed, the pillows still perfectly arranged, the coverlet smooth as fresh snow. She had spent her wedding night alone in the vast Countess's chambers, listening to the clock in the corridor chime away the hours while she stared at the canopy above her bed, her trousseau nightgown feeling like a mockery against her skin. When her lady's maid finally entered with the morning chocolate, the girl's eyes were averted, her hands trembling as she helped Eleanor dress not in one of the beautiful day gowns from her wedding trousseau, but in a simple travelling dress of dark green wool. "His lordship requests your presence in the library, my lady," the maid whispered, and Eleanor descended the grand staircase with dread pooling in her stomach like cold water. Edmund stood by the library window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture she was already learning meant dismissal. "You will leave for Willowmere within the hour," he said without preamble, without turning to face her. "The carriage is being prepared. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, and a minimal staff are already in residence. You will find everything you require there." Eleanor's voice caught in her throat. "I don't understand. Willowmere? But I thought—" "You thought incorrectly," he interrupted, his tone flat as December ice. "Willowmere is a perfectly respectable estate. You will be comfortable there. I have business in London that requires my attention." He finally turned, and for a moment, Eleanor saw something flicker in his grey eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? But it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "This is how it will be," he said, and those 5 words fell like a judge's gavel, sealing her fate. The journey to Willowmere took 6 hours through increasingly remote countryside, and with each mile, Eleanor felt herself travelling further, not just from Thornfield, but from every dream she had harboured, however small, of making something bearable from this arranged marriage. She had not expected love, she was not such a fool, but she had hoped for civility, perhaps companionship, maybe even respect. Instead, she had been dismissed like a servant, banished to an estate she had never seen, separated from her husband before their marriage was even a day old. The landscape grew wilder as they travelled. cultivated fields giving way to rolling moorland, neat hedgerows surrendering to ancient stone walls covered in lichen and ivy. When the carriage finally turned up a long, tree-lined drive, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Willowmere through the gathering dusk, a graceful manor house of honey-colored stone, beautiful in its proportions, but heartbreakingly lonely, with only a few windows glowing with light against the approaching night. It sat in a valley surrounded by dark hills, isolated from everything and everyone, and as Eleanor stepped down from the carriage onto the gravel drive, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that this was not a home. It was a prison, and she had been sentenced to it without trial, without crime, without even the mercy of knowing what she had done to deserve such exile. The first weeks at Willowmere passed in a peculiar suspension of time, each day bleeding into the next, with nothing to distinguish morning from afternoon, except the slant of weak autumn sunlight through windows that rattled in their frames when the wind came howling down from the hills. Eleanor discovered that the house, though structurally sound and undeniably beautiful with its high ceilings and elegant proportions, had been essentially abandoned not to ruin, but to a kind of genteel neglect that spoke of years without a mistress's attention. Dust sheets covered furniture in half the rooms, and when she pulled them away, she found exquisite pieces from another era, a pianoforte sadly out of tune, chairs upholstered in faded rose silk, escritoires with broken locks and empty drawers. The gardens were even more melancholy, their bones still visible beneath the chaos of overgrowth box hedges grown wild and shapeless, rose beds choked with weeds, a fountain in the center of what had once been a formal parterre, now dry and filled with fallen leaves that rustled and whispered when she walked past. Yet there was a haunting beauty to the neglect, a romanticism in the way nature had begun to reclaim what human hands had abandoned. Ivy climbing the south wall in a tapestry of green and gold, and wildflowers blooming defiantly in the cracks between paving stones. Eleanor walked the grounds daily, her shawl wrapped tight against the autumn chill, trying to exhaust herself enough that she might sleep at night without lying awake, replaying the humiliation of her wedding, the coldness of Edmund's dismissal, the dawning realization that she was utterly, completely alone. The staff consisted of Mrs. Dawson, a woman of perhaps 50 with steel-grey hair and a kind but careworn face, two housemaids who were sisters and spoke in hushed whispers, an elderly groundskeeper named Thomas who tipped his cap but rarely spoke, and a cook who sent up adequate meals that Eleanor ate in solitary silence in the small dining room, unable to bear the echoing emptiness of the grand, formal one. She tried to occupy her days with purpose. She explored the library, finding it surprisingly well-stocked with volumes that ranged from agricultural treatises to poetry, and she read voraciously, losing herself in other worlds, other lives, anything to escape the prison of her own thoughts. She attempted to engage Mrs. Dawson in conversation, asking about the house's history, the surrounding countryside, anything to hear another human voice, and the housekeeper responded with careful politeness, revealing little fragments. Yes, the late Countess had loved this house. No, the Earl had not visited in many years, but always maintaining a professional distance that left Eleanor feeling more isolated than before. At night, lying in the Countess's bed in a room that had belonged to Edmund's mother, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation, married but abandoned, titled but powerless, trapped in a beautiful cage with no understanding of her crime and no hope of pardon. November arrived with frost that silvered the overgrown lawns each morning, and Eleanor developed a ritual that became both her salvation and her torment. She would sit at the escritoire in the morning room, the one that overlooked the walled garden, and write letters to her husband that she would never send. "My lord," they began, formal and proper, though sometimes in her more desperate moments she crossed that out and wrote simply, "Edmund," tasting the intimacy of his Christian name even as she knew she had no right to it. She poured everything onto the pages, her confusion at his coldness, her humiliation at being cast aside, her loneliness in this beautiful prison, her dawning anger that warred with the terrible, shameful hope that he might still come, that he might explain, that there might be some reason for this cruelty beyond simple indifference. The letters accumulated in the bottom drawer of the escritoire, sealed but unaddressed, an archive of pain that no one would ever read. To occupy her hands, if not her heart, Eleanor began working in the gardens, starting with the walled kitchen garden, where herbs had gone to seed and vegetable beds lay fallow beneath a tangle of dead growth. She borrowed Thomas's gloves and tools and spent hours on her knees in the cold earth, pulling weeds and cutting back the chaos, finding something almost meditative in the physical labor, the way her muscles ached and her hands blistered, proof that she still existed, that she could still affect something in this world even if she could not affect her own fate. As she worked, memories surfaced unbidden, her father's study in their modest manor house, the afternoon sun, illuminating the desperation in his face as he explained that the investments had failed, that they were ruined, that Eleanor's younger sisters would have no dowries, no seasons, no futures, unless something could be done. Her mother's careful campaign to secure Eleanor a suitable match, the way she had coached Eleanor to be charming but not too clever, accomplished but not too accomplished, pretty but not threatening. The night they received Lord Thornfield's offer, a earl, widowed, young and reportedly reclusive, but titled and wealthy beyond measure, and her mother's tears of relief as she held Eleanor's hands and promised that arranged marriages often bloomed into love, that duty and proximity bred affection, that Eleanor was saving her family and would surely be happy in time. Eleanor had believed her, or perhaps she had simply wanted to believe, had convinced herself that she could make Edmund care for her, that patience and devotion would thaw whatever ice encased his heart. She remembered the hope she had carried to the altar like a fragile flame, certain that once they were wed, once they were truly alone together, he would soften, would see her, would give her the chance to prove herself worthy of the title she was taking. The cruelty was not that he had married her for duty, she had expected that, accepted it, but that he could not even offer her the basic dignity of his presence, could not give her the opportunity to try. It was a grey afternoon in late November when Mrs. Dawson found Eleanor in the library, curled in a window seat with a book she was not really reading, watching the rain streak down the mullioned windows. The housekeeper brought tea without being asked, and for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, she lingered after setting down the tray, her weathered hands twisting in her apron. "Forgive me, my lady," she began, her voice careful, "but I've watched you these weeks, working in those gardens, eating alone, and I think perhaps you deserve to understand." Eleanor set down her book, her heart suddenly racing. "Understand what, Mrs. Dawson?" The older woman settled into a chair opposite her, a breach of protocol that spoke volumes. "His lordship was not always as he is now. When I first came to serve his mother, he was a boy of 14, bright and kind, if serious even then. But the old Earl, his father, was a hard man, given to gambling and mistresses, and the scandal of it hung over the family like a pall. Then came the tragedy. The heir, Lord James, his lordship's older brother, died in a riding accident. Some said it was grief over their father's excesses that made him reckless. The Earl himself passed not 6 months later, his heart giving out, and suddenly Edmund was the Earl at barely 20, saddled with debts and disgrace and the weight of a title he'd never expected to inherit. Eleanor listened, her tea growing cold in her hands, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture. His mother, the Countess, she brought him here to Willowmere to recover, Mrs. Dawson continued, her voice softening with memory. This was her favorite place, away from London's gossip and her husband's ghosts. She worked these gardens herself, and for a time his lordship seemed to heal. Then he met a young woman, Lady Catherine Winters, and we all thought, she paused, choosing her words carefully, we all thought she would save him completely. They were engaged within months, but Lady Catherine, it turned out, cared more for the title than the man. When she discovered the true extent of the Earl's inherited debts, she broke the engagement publicly, cruelly, claiming she could not tie herself to a coronet that came with dishonor. The humiliation nearly destroyed him. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a terrible understanding dawning. And then his mother died the following winter, Mrs. Dawson said quietly. A fever, swift and merciless. After that, his lordship closed Willowmere and never returned, until he sent you here. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor understood now, understood the walls Edmund had built around his heart, the fear that must have seized him when faced with another arranged marriage, another woman who might want only his title, another opportunity for betrayal and loss. But understanding did not ease the sting of rejection, did not warm the cold bed she slept in alone, did not fill the echoing emptiness of this house. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But Mrs. Dawson, I am not Lady Catherine. I never asked for this title, and I certainly never asked to be exiled from my husband before our marriage was even consummated. Whatever wounds he carries, he has inflicted new ones without giving me the chance to prove I am not his enemy." The storm struck on the 1st of December with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had taken offense at Willowmere's melancholy isolation. Eleanor was in the morning room when the wind began to howl, a low keening that rose to a shriek as rain lashed against the windows, with such violence she feared the glass might shatter. Within an hour, water was streaming through a crack in the roof above the east corridor, the ancient lead flashing, finally surrendering after years of neglect, and one of the housemaids came running to Eleanor in tears, reporting that the stable roof had partially collapsed, and Thomas was trying desperately to calm the terrified horses. Eleanor felt something crystallize within her, a clarity she had not experienced since arriving at this lonely estate. This was her house, her responsibility, and there was no one else to manage it. She gathered Mrs. Dawson and issued instructions with a calm authority that surprised even herself. Buckets and basins to catch the water, dust sheets to protect the furniture, blankets to be brought down from the linen closet for the horses if they needed to be moved into the coach house. She pulled on her warmest cloak and ventured out into the storm herself, fighting the wind to reach the stables where Thomas, soaked and struggling, was trying to lead a panicked mare through the chaos of broken timber and driving rain. Eleanor took the horse's bridle without hesitation, speaking soft words of comfort while Thomas secured the other animals, and together they moved all 3 horses to the relative safety of the coach house, working in tandem like soldiers in battle. Back in the main house, she found the younger housemaid, Anna, huddled in the scullery, sobbing with fear as the storm raged and the old house creaked and groaned around them. Eleanor knelt beside her, taking the girl's cold hands in her own. "Listen to me," she said firmly but gently. "This house has stood for 200 years through storms far worse than this. It will stand tonight, and we will stand with it. But I need you to be brave now. Can you help me?" The girl nodded, wiping her tears, and Eleanor set her to work sorting through damaged linens, giving her purpose to override her fear. Throughout that long night, Eleanor moved through Willowmere like a captain on a ship in rough seas, checking on her small crew, assessing damage, making decisions that would have seemed impossible to the uncertain bride who had arrived here 2 months ago. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving destruction in its wake: broken roof tiles, shattered greenhouse glass, fallen trees, flooded cellars, but everyone was safe, and Eleanor felt something she had not felt in months: useful, capable, strong. Later that morning, she sat at the escritoire and wrote to Edmund, not one of her desperate unsent letters, but a brief, factual report: the extent of the damage, the estimated costs of repair, the measures she had taken. She signed it Eleanor Ashworth, Countess of Thornfield, sealed it, and gave it to the groom to post, feeling as she did so that she had crossed some invisible threshold, that she was no longer waiting for her husband to define her existence, but claiming her own authority in his absence. December gave way to the deep cold of January, and something shifted in Eleanor that she could not quite name, but felt in every fiber of her being: a quiet revolution, a turning away from grief toward something that resembled, if not happiness, then at least purpose. She stopped writing the unsent letters to Edmund, stopped checking the drive for carriages that would never come, stopped measuring her days by his absence, and began instead to measure them by what she could build in spite of it. The garden became her passion, not merely a distraction but a genuine calling. She spent hours poring over the agricultural texts in the library, learning about soil composition and pruning techniques, planning elaborate schemes for the spring planting. She ordered bulbs from a catalogue: tulips and daffodils, crocuses and hyacinths, and spent a freezing afternoon planting them in the formal beds, her fingers numb but her heart strangely light at the thought of the future color, the promise of renewal. Thomas, seeing her genuine interest, began to open up, sharing his knowledge accumulated over 40 years of groundskeeping, and together they plotted the resurrection of what had once been one of the finest gardens in the county. Eleanor also discovered the village of Millbrook, a half-hour's walk through the valley, and began to visit the shops and call upon the tenants who worked the estate's farmland. At first they were wary of this strange young countess who had appeared without fanfare and without the Earl, but Eleanor's genuine interest in their lives, her willingness to sit in their simple parlors and listen to their concerns, slowly won them over. She helped arrange for the doctor when old Mr. Peters fell ill, sent baskets of preserves from Willowmere's kitchens to families struggling through the winter, and quietly paid for repairs to the church roof from her own allowance. Word spread that the new countess was not like the old Earl, cold and distant, but kind and present, and gradually Willowmere began to feel less like an exile and more like a home. There were small joys now that punctuated her days like grace notes in a difficult composition. The morning she took her tea to the morning room window and watched mist rise from the valley floor, transforming the landscape into something ethereal and beautiful. The afternoon she found the first snowdrop blooming beneath the oak tree, tiny and perfect and impossibly brave. The evening Mrs. Dawson smiled at her, truly smiled, and said, "You've brought life back to this place, my lady." Eleanor pressed the snowdrop between the pages of her diary and realized with quiet surprise that she had not thought of Edmund for an entire day, had not felt the sharp stab of rejection that had become so familiar, had not yearned for something she could not have. She was learning, slowly and painfully, to build a life from the ruins of her expectations, and while it was not the life she had imagined on her wedding day, it was becoming, in its own way, a life worth living. Edmund Ashworth stood at the window of his London townhouse on Grosvenor Square, a glass of brandy growing warm in his hand, and watched the winter rain turn the cobblestones to black mirrors that reflected the gas lamps like fallen stars. Behind him, the drawing-room blazed with light and luxury: Turkish carpets, Italian paintings, French furniture, all the trappings of wealth and position that meant precisely nothing when one was utterly, irredeemably alone. He had not slept properly since the wedding, had not known a moment's peace since he watched Eleanor's carriage disappear down the drive at Thornfield, taking with it something he refused to name but felt as keenly as a wound. Society called on him, of course. Invitations arrived daily for balls and soirees, musicales and dinners, all eager to welcome the newly married Earl of Thornfield back to London, but he declined them all, unable to bear the questions about his absent countess, unwilling to manufacture lies about her health or her preference for country life. The truth was unspeakable. He had married her and banished her within 12 hours, had looked into her hopeful face at the altar and felt only panic, only the terrible certainty that she was exactly like Catherine, another beautiful woman who wanted his title, his wealth, his position, but not the damaged man who came with them. He told himself he had been wise, that he had protected himself from inevitable betrayal, that it was better to be alone by choice than destroyed by another woman's ambition. But late at night, when the brandy failed to bring oblivion and the house creaked around him in the darkness, Eleanor's face haunted him not as she had looked at the wedding breakfast, confused and hurt, but as she had looked walking down the aisle, nervous but composed, her eyes searching his face for some sign of welcome, some indication that this arranged marriage might become something bearable. He had given her nothing, and the memory of his cruelty ate at him like acid. The flashbacks came unbidden. Catherine's laughter when she told him she could not possibly marry a earl burdened with scandal and debt, the way she had made their broken engagement, the talk of London, painting him as unstable and unsuitable. His mother's death 6 months later, the light going out of her eyes as she whispered that she had hoped to see him happy. The years since then, moving through society like a ghost, his heart encased in ice that he told himself was armor but suspected might be cowardice. When Eleanor's letter arrived, brief, factual, reporting on storm damage at Willowmere, Edmund read it 3 times, searching between the lines for accusation or pleading and finding neither, only competent management and quiet dignity. She had not asked him for anything, had not begged him to visit or explain, had simply informed him of the situation and the steps she had taken to address it. The signature, Eleanor Ashworth, Countess of Thornfield, struck him like a blow, the name she had every right to, but he had never given her the opportunity to claim. For the first time since sending her away, Edmund felt something crack in the frozen fortress of his heart, the terrible, dawning suspicion that he had not protected himself from betrayal, but had instead committed one, that Eleanor was not Catherine, and he had punished an innocent woman for another's sins. February brought a thaw to London, but Edmund felt only the deepening freeze of his own shame as reports from Willowmere began to arrive with increasing frequency. First came a letter from Bridgeworth, his steward, and who had visited the estate to assess the storm damage and remained to compile a comprehensive report. "My lord," it began in Bridgeworth's precise hand, "I must inform you that the Countess has undertaken remarkable improvements at Willowmere. The storm repairs have been completed efficiently and under budget. More notably, her ladyship has initiated restoration of the gardens, established productive relationships with the tenants, and brought a level of management to the estate that it has not enjoyed in many years. I confess I am impressed by her capabilities and dedication." Edmund read the letter twice, then poured another brandy. The words "impressed by her capabilities" echoing in his mind like an accusation. More reports followed, the vicar from Millbrook writing to thank him for his wife's generosity to the parish, mentioning specifically her attention to families in need and her funding of the church roof repairs. A tenant farmer named Hewitt, expressing gratitude that the Countess had arranged for medical care when his wife fell ill, saving them from destitution. Thomas, the groundskeeper, submitting plans for the spring planting that bore Eleanor's annotations in a neat, feminine hand, her suggestions both practical and ambitious. Each piece of correspondence was another stone added to the weight crushing Edmund's chest, another piece of evidence that Eleanor was not the mercenary society beauty he had convinced himself she must be, but rather a woman of substance, compassion, and genuine quality. He began to read her own brief monthly reports with new eyes, searching between the formal lines for the woman she was revealing herself to be. The east pasture fence has been repaired. Tenant Hewitt reports improved grazing. The library roof leak has been addressed. 3 families from the village employed for garden restoration work. Never a complaint, never a request to return to London or Thornfield, never a whisper of the loneliness she must feel or the abandonment she must endure. Only capable management delivered in prose as dignified and restrained as she herself had been at their wedding. Edmund's shame metastasized into something darker, the horrible, creeping realization that he had not been protecting himself but destroying something precious before it even had a chance to exist. Catherine had loved his title and fled from his troubles, yes, but Eleanor had been given his troubles and no title worth speaking of. Exiled to a neglected estate with minimal staff and no husband, and she had not fled or complained or demanded her due. She had simply rolled up her sleeves and built something beautiful from what he had meant as punishment. The internal battle raged within him through sleepless nights. His pride insisted he had been justified, that he could not have known, that keeping his distance was still the safer course. But his conscience, long dormant, roared to life with accusations he could no longer silence. He had judged Eleanor guilty of Catherine's crimes without trial, had sentenced her to exile for sins she had never committed, had taken a young woman who had saved her family through sacrifice and repaid her devotion with cruelty. And now she was thriving without him, building the life at Willowmere that his mother had once dreamed of, and Edmund understood with perfect, agonizing clarity that he was not her jailer, but rather a coward who had locked himself in a prison of his own making. The message arrived on a grey March morning when the wind already carried the promise of violence, delivered by an express rider whose horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold. Severe storm expected to strike the northern counties by nightfall. The meteorological report stated in clinical terms that did nothing to mask the danger. Households advised to secure properties and seek shelter, particular concern for remote estates in valley regions. Edmund's hands trembled as he read it, his mind immediately conjuring images of Willowmere nestled in its isolated valley, vulnerable to flooding, to falling trees, to all the havoc that nature could unleash on that beautiful, lonely place. And Eleanor. Eleanor would face it alone, with only Mrs. Dawson and the small staff, would stand against the tempest as she had stood against everything else he had thrown at her, with dignity and courage, and no one to protect her if something went truly wrong. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was terrified for her, genuinely afraid in a way he had not allowed himself to feel for another human being since his mother's death, and the fear shattered something fundamental in the architecture of his defenses. He paced his study like a caged animal, arguments warring in his mind with increasing desperation. He should send additional staff, should dispatch his steward, should write with instructions and offers of resources, anything except what his heart was screaming at him to do, which was to go himself, to ride to her, to be there when the storm struck, because the thought of Eleanor facing danger alone was suddenly, utterly unbearable. But what right did he have to appear now, after months of abandonment? What possible welcome could he expect from a woman he had treated with such contempt? The shame of it paralyzed him, sent him reaching for the brandy decanter even though it was barely noon, and he drank standing at the window, watching the sky darken as the storm system moved closer, feeling time slip away like water through his fingers. Hours passed in agonizing indecision. He drafted a dozen letters and burned them all, called for his horse, and then cancelled the order, paced and drank and cursed himself for a coward, while the wind began to howl through London's streets and the first fat drops of rain spattered against the window glass. Finally, as afternoon bled into evening and the storm arrived in earnest, something broke in Edmund, some final barrier between fear and action, between pride and desperate need. He could not send a letter, could not dispatch a servant, could not remain safe in London while Eleanor faced danger alone because of his cowardice. He called for his horse, his fastest stallion, and ordered his valet to pack saddlebags for travel. "My lord, the storm," his butler began, but Edmund cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. He pulled on his riding coat, his heavy cloak, checked that his pistol was loaded in case of highwaymen, emboldened by the chaos, and swung into the saddle as rain began to fall in sheets, driven by wind that screamed through the square like something alive and furious. He did not know what he would say when he reached Willowmere, did not know if Eleanor would even allow him through the door, knew only that he had to reach her, had to see with his own eyes that she was safe, had to finally be the husband he should have been from the beginning, even if he was 6 months too late. The storm hit with full fury 20 miles outside London, transforming the road into a river of mud that sucked at his horse's hooves and turned every mile into a battle. Rain fell in blinding sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the wind howled like all the demons of hell were pursuing him, tearing at his cloak and threatening to unseat him with every gust. Edmund bent low over his stallion's neck, urging the animal forward through conditions that any sane man would have recognized as impossible. But sanity had abandoned him somewhere between London and the realization that Eleanor might be in danger because of his cruelty. The horse, a magnificent black beast that had never failed him, began to labor after the first hour, its sides heaving with effort, and Edmund felt a stab of guilt even for this, that he was pushing an innocent animal to its limits in service of his own desperate need for redemption. They passed through villages shuttered tight against the storm, not a soul visible in the driving rain, and twice Edmund nearly lost his seat when the horse shied at debris blown across the road by the screaming wind. His clothes were soaked through within minutes, his hands numb on the reins, water running in rivulets down his face and neck, but he pressed on, driven by images he could not banish. Eleanor alone at Willowmere, the house threatened by flooding or fire or any of a dozen disasters that could befall an isolated estate in a storm like this, and no one there to help her, no one to protect her because her husband, the man who had vowed before God to cherish her, had abandoned her to face everything alone. The memories came with the rhythm of the horse's hooves, each one a lash against his conscience, her face at the altar, trying so hard to find something hopeful in his cold expression. The moment he had told her she was leaving for Willowmere, the confusion and hurt that had flashed across her features before she schooled them into dignity, the unsent wedding night that haunted him with visions of what might have been if he had not been such a coward. He had told himself he was protecting his heart, but he saw now with brutal clarity that he had been protecting only his pride, his fear, his pathetic inability to risk being hurt again. Catherine had wounded him, yes, but Eleanor had done nothing except agree to marry him, had saved her family through sacrifice, had accepted an arranged marriage with grace, and he had repaid her with exile and abandonment. By the time Edmund reached the Golden Heart Inn at the halfway point, he was nearly unrecognizable, mud-spattered, soaking wet, his fine clothes clinging to him like rags, his aristocratic bearing dissolved into the desperate determination of a man possessed. The innkeeper barely glanced at him before providing a fresh horse, too concerned with securing his own property against the storm to question the wild-eyed gentleman who pressed coins into his hand and refused food or rest. Edmund remounted despite the innkeeper's warnings, despite the fact that the storm was worsening rather than abating, despite everything rational thought demanded, because rationality had failed him 6 months ago, and instinct, pure, desperate instinct, was all he had left to guide him to Eleanor. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of Willowmere as afternoon faded toward evening, reviewing her preparations with the calm efficiency of a general before battle. The meteorological warning had arrived that morning via the village constable, and she had immediately set her household into motion with instructions honed by the experience of the December storm and refined by months of managing the estate. The shutters were secured on all the windows facing the prevailing wind. The livestock had been moved to the most protected buildings. The cellars had been cleared of anything that might be damaged by flooding, and emergency supplies, candles, lamp oil, bandages, preserved food had been gathered in the central rooms of the house. Mrs. Dawson moved through the corridors with quiet competence, her earlier reserve toward Eleanor long since transformed into something approaching partnership, while the housemaids checked and double-checked that nothing had been overlooked. Thomas had spent the day securing the gardens as best he could, staking the young plants Eleanor had put in, clearing the drainage channels, and moving tools and equipment under cover. Eleanor had worked alongside them all, her sleeves rolled up, her hair coming loose from its pins, and she felt no shame in it. She was the mistress of this estate, and its welfare was her responsibility, a role she had grown into with something that felt remarkably like pride. She thought of Edmund briefly as she surveyed her preparations, a fleeting consideration without the sharp edge of pain that such thoughts had once carried. He was in London, she supposed, safe in his townhouse on Grosvenor Square, perhaps not even aware that a storm threatened his neglected country estate. There was a time when this would have filled her with bitter resentment, but now she felt only a distant sadness for what might have been, and a strange gratitude for what was. She had built something here in his absence, and had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, had found purpose, and even a measure of contentment in the life circumstances had forced upon her. She was not the timid girl who had arrived here 6 months ago, confused and heartbroken. She was the Countess of Thornfield in more than name, and Willowmere was hers in every way that mattered, shaped by her hands and her vision into something beautiful and thriving. As darkness fell and the first gusts of wind began to rattle the shutters, Eleanor gathered her small household in the drawing-room, where a fire blazed against the gathering cold. "We've weathered storms before," she told them, her voice steady and reassuring, "and we'll weather this one. Stay together, stay calm, and remember that this house has stood for 2 centuries. It will stand tonight." The words had barely left her lips when the full fury of the storm struck, wind screaming around the house like something alive and malevolent, rain hammering against the windows with such force that the glass seemed to bow inward, and somewhere in the darkness a tremendous crash announced that something, a tree, a chimney, some piece of the world torn loose, had surrendered to the tempest's rage. The second horse went lame 15 miles from Willowmere, stumbling on the treacherous road and nearly throwing Edmund before he managed to pull the animal to a shuddering stop. He dismounted in the driving rain, his boots sinking into mud up to his ankles, and felt along the horse's foreleg to confirm what he already knew: a pulled tendon, possibly worse, and the beast could carry him no further without risking permanent injury. Edmund stood in the middle of that god-forsaken road, rain pouring down his face, and for a moment the sheer impossibility of what he was attempting threatened to overwhelm him. He was still miles from Eleanor. Night had fallen completely. The storm showed no signs of abating, and he was alone on foot in conditions that could kill a man through exposure alone. Then he thought of her facing this same fury without him, and he started walking, leading the limping horse behind him, his legs burning with effort as he pushed forward through mud that seemed determined to drag him down into the earth. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, he spotted a light through the darkness, a farmhouse, shuttered against the storm but showing a glow from within that promised warmth and possibly salvation. He pounded on the door until a grizzled farmer opened it, taking in Edmund's disheveled appearance with wide eyes. "I need a horse," Edmund said without preamble, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "I'll pay whatever you ask. My wife is at Willowmere, and I have to reach her." Something in his face, or perhaps in the desperation of his words, moved the farmer to agree, and within minutes Edmund was mounted on a sturdy farm horse, pressing more money into the man's hands than the animal was worth, and plunging back into the storm. The landscape had become a nightmare realm of wind and water, familiar landmarks rendered invisible by the darkness and rain, the road barely discernible from the surrounding fields that had transformed into shallow lakes. Edmund's new mount was game but slow, and his frustration mounted with every labored stride, every minute that passed while Eleanor remained beyond his reach. He pushed the horse harder than was wise, and when they crested a hill where the wind hit with renewed fury, Edmund felt himself sliding sideways in the saddle, his numb hands losing their grip on the reins, and then he was falling, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs and send pain shooting through his ribs. He lay in the mud for a moment, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue, his left arm screaming with what might be a broken bone or merely a vicious bruising, and the voice of reason whispered that he should stay down, should seek shelter, should wait for dawn and better conditions. But Eleanor's face rose before him, not cold or accusing, but simply as she had been at their wedding, hopeful despite everything, trying so hard to find something worth loving in him, and he forced himself to his feet, caught the horse's reins, and pulled himself back into the saddle through sheer force of will. The self-loathing that had been building for months crystallized into something pure and terrible. He had done this to her, had taken her hope and crushed it, had sent her away to face everything alone, and if he died on this road trying to reach her, it would be no more than he deserved. The pounding on Willomere's door came near midnight, frantic and irregular, barely audible above the storm's fury, but insistent enough that Eleanor heard it from the drawing room, where she sat with Mrs. Dawson, listening to the wind trying to tear the house apart. She rose immediately, taking a candle despite the housekeeper's protest, some instinct she could not name driving her toward the door with her heart suddenly racing. When she pulled it open against the force of the gale, the sight that met her eyes seemed impossible, hallucinatory. A man, barely recognizable as human beneath the layers of mud and rain, swaying on the threshold with one hand braced against the doorframe as though it alone kept him upright. For a heartbeat she did not know him, and then recognition struck like lightning. Edmund, her husband, here. His face was deathly pale beneath the grime, his clothes torn and soaked through, his left arm held at an odd angle against his ribs, and his eyes were wild and desperate, and fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Eleanor," he managed, his voice a rasp that was barely audible over the storm, and then his legs buckled, and he would have fallen if she hadn't dropped the candle and lunged forward to catch him, her arms going around him instinctively, despite the shock that roared through her mind like its own tempest. "Mrs. Dawson," she cried, and the housekeeper was there in an instant, helping her half-carry, half-drag Edmund into the entrance hall and kick the door shut against the wind. They lowered him into a chair, and Eleanor found herself kneeling before her husband, her hands trembling as she pushed the wet hair back from his forehead, checking for fever, for signs of serious injury, beyond the obvious exhaustion and exposure. His breathing was labored, his skin cold as ice, and when she carefully probed his left arm, he hissed in pain through clenched teeth. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, though whether she was asking him or herself she could not say. "Traveling in this storm, you could have been killed." But the words died as Edmund's hand suddenly caught hers, his grip weak but desperate, and he looked at her with such raw emotion that her anger and confusion evaporated like mist. "Had to reach you," he managed. "The storm couldn't let you. Alone." Mrs. Dawson brought blankets, hot water, bandages, and Eleanor worked with hands that had grown steady through months of managing crises, stripping away Edmund's ruined coat and shirt to reveal bruised ribs and the arm that was swelling but mercifully not broken. The silence between them was charged with everything unsaid, 6 months of absence and hurt and transformation, filling the space where words should be. Eleanor cleaned the mud and blood from his skin with careful, gentle touches, her face a mask of concentration that hid the storm raging inside, her shock that he was here, confusion about why, anger at the danger he'd risked, and beneath it all, something she refused to name that felt dangerously like hope. Edmund watched her through half-closed eyes, too exhausted to speak but unable to look away, and when she bound his ribs with steady hands, he shuddered not from pain but from the first tender touch he had felt in longer than he could remember. Dawn broke grey and exhausted over Willowmere, the storm having finally spent its fury in the small hours of the morning, leaving behind a landscape littered with broken branches and debris but mercifully intact. Eleanor had spent the night in a chair by the fire in the drawing room, where they had settled Edmund, dozing fitfully while Mrs. Dawson kept watch, and when she woke to find him sitting up, his eyes already on her face, she felt her carefully constructed composure threaten to crumble. He looked terrible in the morning, light bruised, pale, his arm bound and his ribs wrapped, but there was something different in his expression, a rawness that had not been there on their wedding day, as though the storm had stripped away more than just his fine clothes and aristocratic bearing. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice still hoarse but steady, and Eleanor felt anger flare hot in her chest. "An explanation," she repeated, and heard the bitter edge in her own voice. 6 months, Edmund. 6 months of silence and exile, and you think an explanation will suffice?" She rose from her chair, needing distance, needing air, but he spoke again before she could move away. "No," he said quietly, "nothing will suffice. Nothing I say can undo what I've done to you, but you deserve to know the truth, even if it damns me further in your eyes." And so he told her, the words coming slowly at first and then faster, as though a dam had broken. About Catherine Winters, about the engagement and the public betrayal, about his conviction that all women of society wanted only titles and wealth, and would abandon him the moment they discovered the cost of his name. He told her about his mother's death, about closing Willowmere because he could not bear the memories, about the years of isolation he had wrapped around himself like armor. And then, with his voice breaking, he told her about their wedding day, how he had looked at her and seen only Catherine, how fear had masqueraded as wisdom, how he had convinced himself he was being prudent when he was actually being cruel. "I punished you for her sins," he said, and there were tears on his face now, shameless and raw. "I looked at you and saw a threat instead of a person, a schemer instead of the innocent young woman you were. I told myself I was protecting my heart, but Eleanor," he stopped, struggling for words. "I was just a coward, and you have suffered for my cowardice every day since." Eleanor stood frozen, her emotions, a tangle she could not begin to sort, anger that he had judged her so unjustly, grief for the months of loneliness she had endured, exhaustion at the weight of carrying this marriage alone, and beneath it all, a reluctant understanding of the wounds that had driven him. "You had no right," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Whatever Catherine did to you, whatever pain you carried, you had no right to assume I was the same. You didn't even try to know me, Edmund. You married me and discarded me in the same breath, and I have spent 6 months building a life from the ruins you left me." She saw him flinch at her words but pressed on. "I don't know what you want from me now. Forgiveness? Absolution? I can't give you those things, not yet, perhaps not ever. You rode through a storm to reach me, and that means something, but it doesn't erase the storm you created in my life." Edmund did not leave. Eleanor half expected him to return to London once he had delivered his confession, once the storm had passed and the roads were passable again, but he stayed, taking up residence in a guest room in the East Wing, as far from her chambers as the house allowed, and asking nothing of her except permission to remain. "I don't expect forgiveness," he told her that first morning, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands like a petitioner rather than the master of the house. "But if you'll allow it, I'd like to help repair the damage from the storm. It's the least I can do." She had agreed, more from exhaustion than generosity, and watched with wary eyes as her husband transformed himself from earl to laborer. He worked alongside Thomas and the men from the village, his fine hands blistering as he hauled fallen branches, repaired fences damaged by falling trees, and cleared debris from the drainage channels. He did not direct or command, but took instruction from those who knew the work better, and Eleanor saw the surprise in the tenants' eyes when the Earl of Thornfield actually asked them, how best to mend a stone wall or shore up a damaged outbuilding. The days accumulated into weeks, and Eleanor found herself observing him despite her determination to maintain distance. She saw him one morning in the kitchen, speaking to Mrs. Dawson with genuine warmth, thanking her for her years of service to Willowmere, and actually apologizing for his long neglect of the estate she had kept running in his absence. The housekeeper's eyes had filled with tears, and she had patted his hand with a tenderness that spoke of old affection rekindled. Eleanor saw him in the village, stopping to speak with old Mr. Hewitt, the tenant farmer whose wife had fallen ill months before, and she was close enough to hear Edmund's words. "I understand the Countess arranged for the doctor. I should have been here to do it myself. I'm sorry for my absence. Hewitt, it won't happen again." The old man had looked stunned, then grateful, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. But it was the afternoon she found Edmund in the garden that truly moved her. He was on his knees in the south border, the restored bed where she had planted bulbs through the winter, and he was carefully setting a young oak sapling into the earth, his hands gentle despite their new calluses. She stood watching from the terrace until he noticed her, and when he straightened, there was soil on his face and something almost shy in his expression. "Thomas told me your mother loved oak trees," she said quietly, moving closer. "That there used to be one here before it died." "Yes," Edmund replied. "She planted it when I was born. I thought perhaps this garden could use a new one, if you approve." Eleanor looked at the sapling, at the care with which he had positioned it, at the vulnerability in his eyes as he waited for her response, and felt the wall around her heart crack a little wider. "It will take years to grow," she said, "decades before it's fully mature." "I know," he said, holding her gaze. "I'm hoping I'll be here to see it." Spring arrived tentatively at Willowmere, the first green shoots pushing through earth still cold from winter, and with it came a thawing of a different sort. Eleanor and Edmund began to talk, not the formal exchanges of estate management or polite pleasantries over dinner, but real conversations that started hesitantly and gradually deepened into something approaching understanding. It began one evening when Eleanor was reading in the library and Edmund entered, stopping at the doorway as though uncertain of his welcome. "May I join you?" he asked, and when she nodded, he settled into the chair opposite hers, the fire crackling between them like a living thing. They sat in silence for a time, both pretending to read, until Edmund finally set down his book and asked, "What was it like, those first weeks here, when I sent you away?" Eleanor looked up, surprised by the directness of the question, by the genuine need to know that she heard in his voice. She considered dissembling, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through 6 months of loneliness, but something in his expression, open and undefended, in a way she had never seen, made her choose truth instead. "Devastating," she said quietly. "I felt like I had been judged and found wanting without ever being given a chance to prove myself. I wrote you letters I never sent, begging you to explain what I had done wrong, what I could do differently. I thought perhaps I was not pretty enough, or accomplished enough, or that I had said something at the wedding breakfast that offended you." She watched him flinch at her words but continued. "But gradually, I stopped waiting for your approval and started building something for myself. The gardens became mine, the tenants became mine. Even this house, your mother's house, became mine, in a way I think you'll understand. I discovered I was stronger than I thought, more capable. I suppose, in a terrible way, your abandonment gave me the freedom to find out who I was when no one was watching." Edmund was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as though he struggled with words that would not come. "I am sorrier than I can express," he finally said, "but I'm also, and I know I have no right to feel this grateful, that you found that strength, even if it was despite me rather than because of me." The conversations became a nightly ritual and then expanded to afternoon walks through the gardens Eleanor had restored. Edmund asking about each plant, each design choice, listening with genuine interest as she explained her vision for the rose garden, her plans for the kitchen garden, her hope to eventually restore the greenhouse. He told her about his childhood at Willowmere, about his mother's love for this place, about the boy he had been before. Tragedy and betrayal had hardened him, and Eleanor found herself softening toward this version of Edmund, vulnerable and honest, in ways the cold Earl at her wedding had never been. One afternoon, as they stood in the library examining an old volume of botanical illustrations, their hands reached for the same page simultaneously, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his fingers against hers like an electric current. Neither pulled away immediately, and in that suspended moment, Eleanor felt her heart beating faster, felt something shift between them from understanding towards something more dangerous, more hopeful, more terrifying in its possibility. The third storm arrived in late April with an unseasonable fury, bringing not rain but snow that fell thick and fast, transforming Willowmere into an island cut off from the world. Within hours, the roads were impassable, the village unreachable, and Mrs. Dawson informed Eleanor and Edmund that the staff who lived off the estate could not make it through until the weather cleared. For the first time since Edmund's arrival months ago, they were truly alone together, forced into a proximity that might have been awkward had they not already spent weeks building the fragile bridge of conversation between them. The first day, they moved around each other carefully, maintaining the polite distance that had become their habit. But by the second morning, when Eleanor came down to find no fire laid and no breakfast prepared, reality asserted itself. "I suppose we'll have to manage ourselves," she said, finding Edmund already in the kitchen, looking bemused by the array of pots and provisions. "I haven't cooked since I was a boy sneaking into the kitchen at Thornfield," he admitted, and Eleanor felt herself actually smile at the image. Together they managed to produce something resembling breakfast, laughing when Edmund burned the toast, and Eleanor oversalted the eggs, and in that laughter, Eleanor realized with a shock that this was the first time she had heard genuine joy in his voice, the first time they had shared something as simple and profound as amusement. The days trapped by the snow developed their own rhythm. Edmund kept the fires going while Eleanor managed their simple meals. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, taking turns with novels from the library, and Eleanor discovered that Edmund had a gift for voices and characterization that made even familiar stories come alive. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, they found themselves talking late into the night, the conversation drifting from books to childhood memories to the people they had been and the people they were becoming. "I love who you've become," Edmund said suddenly, his voice raw with emotion. "The woman who saved these gardens, who earned the loyalty of the tenants, who faced storms alone and emerged stronger, Eleanor, you're extraordinary, and I mourn the man I was who couldn't see it, who was too afraid to even try." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she met his gaze steadily. "I'm not the woman you married," she said quietly. "That girl died in the first weeks here, when I realized no one was coming to save me. I had to save myself, and in doing so, I became someone else entirely, someone harder perhaps, but also more complete. I don't know if the woman I am now can forgive the man you were, but I think," she paused, searching for truth in the tangle of her emotions, "I think she might be able to love the man you're becoming." The words hung between them like a promise, fragile and precious, and when Edmund reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, Eleanor let him, feeling the warmth of his touch anchor them both against the storm that raged outside and the hope that bloomed, tentative but real, within. The snow finally stopped on the fourth day, leaving Willowmere wrapped in white silence, and Eleanor woke to find sunlight streaming through her window for the first time in what felt like weeks. She found Edmund in the morning room, standing at the window that overlooked the gardens now blanketed in pristine snow, and something about the set of his shoulders, both hopeful and uncertain, made her heart ache with a tenderness she had not allowed herself to feel before. "Edmund," she said softly, and when he turned to her, she saw in his eyes the same vulnerability she felt in her own heart. "I've been thinking about what you said, about loving who I've become, and I realized something. I can't go back to being the girl who walked down the aisle 6 months ago, hoping to please a husband who wouldn't even look at her. That girl is gone." She watched him start to speak, to apologize again, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. I can't be her again, and I don't think you can be the man who sent her away. We're different people now, shaped by pain and separation and the work of becoming better than we were. So I've decided." She took a breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of something vast and terrifying. "I've decided I want to try, not to reclaim what we should have been, but to build something new, something real. If you're willing." Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, see the emotion naked on his face. "Eleanor," he breathed, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer, like absolution, like everything she had not known she needed to hear. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that chance, trying to be the husband you deserve. I swear it." She reached up, her hand trembling only slightly, and touched his face the first time she had initiated such contact, the first time she had claimed the right to tenderness. "Then we begin again," she whispered. "Not in London, not at Thornfield, but here. Willowmere is home. We'll return to the city when duty demands, but this place we've both learned to love, this is where we build our life." Edmund's hand came up to cover hers against his cheek, and then he was leaning down, his intention clear in his eyes, giving her time to refuse, to pull away. But Eleanor rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips finally touched, It was gentle and tentative and nothing like the cold, perfunctory kiss they had shared at the altar. This kiss was a promise, a beginning, a recognition of all they had survived to reach this moment. When they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. "I will be honest with you," he said softly, "even when it's difficult. I will be brave enough to be vulnerable, to let you see all of me, the broken parts and the healing ones. And I will choose you, Eleanor, every single day for the rest of my life." "And I will choose you," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Every day. We'll build this together." 2 years had passed since that spring morning when Eleanor and Edmund chose to begin again, and Willowmere had been transformed from a house of exile into a home of joy. The gardens bloomed in riotous color, roses climbing the south wall in cascades of pink and cream, the formal beds alive with tulips and peonies and lavender that scented the air like perfume, and in the center of it all, the young oak tree Edmund had planted grew strong and straight, its branches already beginning to spread toward the sky. On a golden afternoon in May, Eleanor stood at the morning room window watching her husband chase their son through those gardens, 3-year-old James shrieking with laughter as Edmund caught him and swung him high, and in her arms, their daughter Catherine, named without irony or bitterness, but as a symbol of forgiveness, dozed peacefully, her tiny fist curled against Eleanor's shoulder. This was happiness, Eleanor thought, not the dramatic, sweeping kind she had once imagined in her girlish dreams, but something deeper and more precious, the daily choice to love, to forgive, to build something beautiful from broken foundations. Edmund came in from the garden, James riding on his shoulders, both of them flushed and laughing, and when he saw Eleanor standing there with their daughter, something in his expression made her breath catch even now, even after 2 years of marriage that had finally become real. "You saved me," he said later that evening, after the children were asleep and they sat together in the drawing room, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Everything I have, everything I am now, it's because you had the courage to give me a second chance." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, seeing the man he had become, still capable of melancholy, still carrying scars from his past, but open now, vulnerable, brave enough to love without armor. "No," she said gently, reaching up to touch his face. "We saved each other. You gave me the space to discover my strength, even if you didn't mean to, and I gave you the forgiveness you needed to become the man you were always meant to be. We built this together, Edmund. Every hard conversation, every moment of choosing trust over fear, every day we decided to try, that's what saved us both." Dear listener, perhaps you wonder why I tell you this story of a cold wedding and a long redemption. It is because transformation is rarely instantaneous, rarely easy, and never without cost. Love, true love, requires the patience to wait for walls to crumble, the courage to be vulnerable when every instinct screams for self-protection, and the wisdom to understand that we are all carrying wounds that shape how we see the world. Edmund punished Eleanor for another woman's sins, yes, but how many of us do the same, letting past hurts dictate present choices, building prisons we call protection? And yet, if we are brave enough to risk our hearts again, if we are patient enough to give others the chance to grow, if we are honest enough to admit our own failings and humble enough to ask for forgiveness, we might discover that redemption is always possible, that no one is beyond saving, and that the most beautiful gardens sometimes grow in the soil of our deepest sorrows. Everyone deserves a second chance to be seen for who they truly are, rather than who we fear they might be, to prove that they can change, to build something new from the ruins of what was. May you find the courage to offer such chances, and the grace to accept them when they are offered to you. May you sleep well tonight, knowing that transformation is always possible, that love can bloom even in the coldest soil, and that sometimes the longest journey is the one from fear to trust. Rest now, and dream of gardens waiting to be planted, of storms weathered together, of love that is earned rather than assumed, and of all the beautiful things that patience and courage can create. Until we meet again in another tale, may peace find you where you are.